Hello, I'm Brad Edwards. Thank you for joining us here in the stream. 50 years ago, 1972, Chicago was in a state of transition. Race, crime, the economy, front and center then and now. Then we examined the trends and what the city needed to do to change 50 years ago. Let's take a look.
Good evening, I'm Bob McBride. This is part of our videotape complex here at TV2 News. It's kind of like the memory bank of a computer, except instead of numbers, it turns out sounds and pictures. Sounds and pictures that help us tell the story of a city in transition. This has been an active year, even for Chicagoans who are accustomed to action. We could let our memory bank spin out bits and pieces of news stories like these from the first half of the year. That's the simplest way to sum it up. But videotape machines can only give us a replay of events. They can't explain them. So we'll spend the next half hour with reporters from the TV2 News team. We'll talk about events, of course, but we'll concentrate on the patterns, the trends behind those events in Chicago's neighborhoods, in local government, and in the suburbs. We'll try to describe the forces that might pull us apart and the qualities that might pull us together. Every night we report the news here in our TV2 News studio, Studio 2 at CBS, but it's in the newsroom that we actually sort things out. That's the place we sit down and talk among ourselves. Tonight we invite you to join us.
Chicago in Transition, the Legacy 72. The Challenge 73 is sponsored by Santa Fe, the complete transportation company.
The Second City. When the New Yorker magazine pinned that label on Chicago, the Second City, the picture that went with the article showed a false front, a glittering shoreline with a wasteland behind it. Well, that was a distorted picture back in the 1950s, and it still is today. But it could turn out to be prophetic. Bob Wallace has some facts about that. Bob?
Oh, Bob, the standard indicators say Chicago's still healthy economically, but it's not as strong as it used to be. Right now, the city is losing 20,000 jobs a year and gaining 9,000 welfare clients. Nobody likes to say this, but a lot of it has to do with the black problem. At least that's what you call it if you're white. If you're black, it's a white problem. Anyway, since 1960, more than 500,000 whites have left the city, but the black population has grown by about 350,000. The whites are heading for the suburbs. Most of the suburbs are still at least 99% white. And despite all the open housing laws, blacks are staying behind in the city. 12 years ago, just one black family out of 10 lived in the suburbs. Today, it's only about 1 out of 12. The growth of suburbia means a more hectic rush hour for just about everybody, and that includes the 40,000 black people who commute to work in the suburbs. And sometime next year, for the first time ever, there will be more jobs outside the city than in it. Property values, house prices are actually going down in the city. They're going up, of course, in most of the suburbs. Now, all these changes have been accelerated by the developers. They've been filling up the north side and the suburbs with high-rises and new houses. They've built so many, we actually have a housing surplus. What happens is that middle-class whites move out of changing neighborhoods into the new developments. The changing neighborhoods, in turn, become all black, and the neighborhoods the blacks leave behind, they just fall apart. White families have more money than black families, and that gap gets wider every year. And about 1 out of 5 black families is below the poverty line and can't pay too much in taxes. If the whites and their money keep flowing out of Chicago, the city will eventually go broke. One way to stop that from happening might be to put a freeze on new housing in the Chicago area. Somehow, though, that just doesn't seem very likely. A lot of whites are moving out because the Chicago schools are so bad. So we might try a metropolitan school system. But that doesn't seem very likely either. In other words, Bob, it's going to take some pretty strong medicine to keep Chicago alive, but so far it looks as though we just don't have the nerve to swallow it.
Bob, something you said about housing patterns reminds me of a statistic about segregation in Chicago. If every neighborhood were to become perfectly integrated tomorrow, 90% of the total population, 9 out of every 10 citizens, would have to move overnight in order to accomplish that instant integration. TV2 News reporter Harry Porterfield has covered a lot of stories on that subject. Harry?
Bob, if there was any sign that race relations are improving in Chicago, it wasn't noticed very much in 1972. A single glimpse of the confrontations at Gage Park High School is almost sufficient to sour even the sweetest memory of the year. But worse than that, it could be the flavor of the future. There have been racial skirmishes there in the past, but none like the most recent clashes between black and white students. Hatred was the element not seen before. There's the fear that the presence of black students in the high school heralds a black migration into that predominantly white community, and neither the fear nor the hatred are likely to cool in the year to come. In the Austin area, white parents have avoided a Gage Park situation by taking their youngsters out of Austin High School as it shifted to a predominantly black enrollment. Although violence on the scale of Gage Park High appears to be the exception, white resistance to the black migration is still marked by acts of vandalism and individual violence. Disenchantment with urban living and the availability of mortgage money are inducing many black families to move to the southern suburbs. Generally, middle-class blacks can afford to move, while those locked in poverty may be losing ground, and the distance between the two just might be growing. For one thing, the president is talking about belt-tightening. Observers say that will mean a reduction or even an elimination of job training programs, educational projects for dropouts, and retraining programs for unskilled people thrown out of work through automation or laid off in employment cutbacks. Many blacks without skills may have no opportunity at a job, while those with professional or technical abilities will fare much better. Cook County Hospital acknowledged the problem with unskilled in finding work when it set up an employment office to help the 1,000 laid off there recently. The Kerner report of 4 years ago predicted that without large sums of money being spent to upgrade living conditions in inner cities and to improve educational and job opportunities for minorities, racial polarization would continue. Judging by the past year, it's difficult to see any trend in Chicago that's going to make that condition better in 1973. Bob?
Well, Harry, as you know, Susan Anderson once was a school teacher, and now she frequently reports on that subject for TV2 News. Susan, how would you say our schools have fared during this past year?
Well, it's almost a cliche, Bob, but we are getting nowhere in educating kids in big city schools. Compared to 100 11th graders nationally, 64 read better than the average Chicago high school junior. Absenteeism is another factor. In Chicago, the average student attends 9 days, then misses a day. In the suburbs, it's 15 days of school to 1 day missed. The school board has begun several experimental schools to curb this trend. One is Metro High, where the classroom becomes a subway, factory, or TV studio. But the school board says lack of money prohibits Metro's expansion. Chicago and every other urban school district is going broke. Schools are financed primarily by the local property tax. This results in Evanston Township spending $2,203 to educate each child, and Chicago spending one-half that, $1,053 per child. Several state Supreme Courts have ruled the states should collect all local property taxes and distribute the money equitably between districts. The issue is now before the U.S. Supreme Court. Parochial schools educate 1 out of 5 Chicago youngsters. These schools are in financial straits, too. Next year, they may be getting some financial relief in the form of tax credits to parents. Educators say the mood of students is changing. Students are now less outspoken. Group conformity is more important. Cheerleading is back in vogue. No one seems to know why, but it's a trend to watch. Schools have been forced to lead the way in racial integration. Probably no issue has caused more furor than busing. But now both blacks and whites are saying busing is not the answer to quality education or even racial balance. Teacher strikes are expected to continue to plague the schools, with a threatened walkout by Chicago teachers on the 1st of the new year. Governor-elect Dan Walker says schools are his #1 priority. He has pledged more state money to Chicago schools. When Walker becomes governor, watch to see whether he keeps education at the top of his list. Bob?
And another TV2 newsroom regular with us tonight is John Drummond. Because of his tenacity, we call him the Bulldog Drummond. John frequently covers police stories for TV2 News. We'll have his report on the crime situation after this. Chicago television viewers call us up or write us lots of letters about a lot of news stories. But crime stories, naturally enough I suppose, seem to get people more worked up than anything else. John Drummond has a report now from the police beat. John?
Bob, everybody squawks about crime, especially the politicians.
but they never seem to mention that much of our police work is squandered on things like arresting drunks or handing out traffic tickets. In spite of that, the crime rate in Chicago has been fairly steady recently. In fact, serious crime is down about 3% this year. In the suburbs, though, it's a different story. The suburban crime rate is more than twice as high as it was a decade ago. Of course, the suburban population is going up too. But we don't need any statistics to know that there's too much violent crime and not enough police manpower to deal with it. Part of the answer might be to let the police forget about so-called victimless crime, like gambling and prostitution. That way, police could spend more time concentrating on really serious crimes, the kind where people get hurt. There are experts who even think we ought to do the same thing about drug addiction. They contend that addicts should be allowed to buy drugs at low cost from a public health agency. That way, they wouldn't go around stealing cars or clobbering people on the head to finance an expensive habit. That may be a far-out theory, but one police official told me that half the auto thefts and burglaries in suburban Cook County are probably committed by addicts. Drug users account for so much of our crime problem that the whole thing boils down to this: either we find some way to solve the soaring drug problem, or else we keep getting mugged on the streets. In the meantime, the fellows who sell handguns, guard dogs, and burglar alarm devices continue to do a land office business. Bob?
John, there's a special kind of crime we haven't talked about yet tonight: crimes against the earth we live on. Those crimes still are being committed. But Robert Osborne says there is some good news along with the bad news. Robert?
Bob, the environmental movement has broken down, and because it has broken down, it has matured. It no longer is a holier-than-holy crusade manifested by people carrying signs. One reason for abandoning those tactics is that a lot of laws have been passed that, if enforced, will clean up the air and the water. Another reason is that people realized there was a lot they could be doing in their own backyards. So the environmental movement is broken down into countless local efforts within individual communities. Everything from recycling to traffic flow to the establishment of parks. The big noisy battles showed people that government could be made to listen. There's a body of opinion to the effect that when the history of this period in American life is written, the environmental movement will be credited with a significant role in unifying society. Through it, people learned again to work together to communicate. There has been a lot of progress in Chicago this past year when it comes to solving local problems. There has not been much progress when it comes to the major problems, just a lot of talk. Concern continues about the future of Lake Michigan. The federal government and the 4 lake states met several times. Finally, they backed away from a previous decision not to allow hot water discharges and decided instead it would be a good idea to study the whole matter and get some scientific evidence. There was little progress toward some kind of comprehensive land use planning. A few developments proposed for floodplains were stopped, but there still is no agency with a responsibility for determining what is the highest and the best use of any particular parcel of land. The state of Illinois did pass laws to prevent the rape of the landscape that has occurred from strip mining in the past. But the state legislature again refused to pass a bill to preserve the few scenic rivers in the state. In the coming year, we will see a continuation on the national level of the spirited battle about the safety and the wisdom of nuclear power plants. It will especially affect northern Illinois, where Commonwealth Edison has committed its future to nuclear plants, and it could have a major effect on the huge Zion plant scheduled for operation this coming year. Chicago and Illinois have made considerable progress, and that allows us to just about hold our own in the battle to preserve the environment. This next year should establish how committed government, at both the federal and the state levels, is to winning that battle, especially now that the elections are passed.
And Robert Osborne will be following that story for you all during 1973. It'll be an interesting year on the Chicago sports scene, too, and Brent Musburger will tell us all about that. Brent?
Bob, I guess the key question is whether or not next year will be any different than this or the years before. In other words, will one of Chicago's teams finally produce that winner that the fans have been yearning for? The Cubs have wasted more talent than any team in the National League. Next year, the Cubs are going to be a year older, and the only way they're going to win that championship is for Pittsburgh to fall apart. The White Sox on the South Side are a younger, maturing team, but it'll still take another sensational year from Dick Allen for the Sox to defeat California. That's right, California. The Oakland A's will collapse under the weight of their own success and the whims of Charlie Finley, and Allen has to hit another 30 homers. As for the Bears, it depends on Bobby Douglas. Will he finally become a quarterback, or will Abe Gibran have to find someone else? The Bears could be still 3 years away from a challenging position. The Blackhawks' chances for a Stanley Cup disappeared with this man, Robert Marvin Hull. The Hawks will win the West, but they lack the firepower to beat Montreal, New York, and Boston. Hull now is skating for that other league, and next week he'll be going against the Cougars down in the amphitheater. But other than those occasional visits from Bobby Hull, the Cougars do not have much to cheer. In professional basketball, the Bulls will be much the same. Good desire, good hustle, but they do not have the height to match one Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and the Milwaukee Bucks. College basketball, Loyola and DePaul, both improved, but not in a class with UCLA. Northwestern, not too much to be happy about. But in college football, Northwestern figures to be much stronger next fall, but then I guess so does Woody Hayes. And Bob, if we're looking for a champion, we're going to have to drive down the turnpike to South Bend, Indiana, and watch Eric Parsegian's Notre Dame team next year. They could win it all.
So there's no point getting out the flags and the pom-poms and everything for Chicago.
No, Bob, I tell you, as far as sports is concerned, unfortunately, Chicago still is the second city.
Well, Brent, when it comes to politics anyway, a lot of things may be different in 1973. Bob Fall will be talking about that in just a minute. The political parties had their usual primaries and conventions this year. But on Election Day, many voters didn't care what party a candidate belonged to, and political coattails just about went out of style. Bob Fall has more on that. Bob?
The question now, Bob, is what that unprecedented ticket splitting means for the so-called Daily Machine. Despite the Nixon landslide, the organization did deliver Chicago for McGovern, did keep its congressman and the patronage-rich county clerk's office. But the city barely supported Daley's senatorial candidate. It rejected his attorney general choice, and the machine lost the prize it treasured most, the state's attorney's office. Edward Hanrahan carried Chicago, but he lost the election largely because the city's black voters repudiated him in former machine strongholds. In these black wards on the city's south side, Hanrahan also just squeaking by in the 4th, the machine's backyard. Hanrahan also battered in these lakefront wars, losing 2-1 in the 42nd, which the machine thought was safe. Administration Aldermen Cohen, Headland, Sperling, and Wagoda know that their districts are changing and that if they do not, they will face stiff independent opposition. The same prospect facing at least 6 other aldermen. Independents will run hard in at least 26 wards in the 1975 aldermanic elections, all of which suggests that in 1973 the mayor's grip on the city council will weaken. People who work for Mayor Daley say they would not be surprised if he seeks re-election in 1975. His opponents expect him to, and to win. In 1973, Daley will confront Governor-elect Dan Walker, whose aides admit that Governor Ogilvy left state government in good working order, giving Walker 2 years to assemble the kind of coalition he wants in Springfield. Senator Charles Percy is already gathering a media staff for a national campaign. Attorney General William Scott will decide in 73 whether to seek the Senate in 74 or the governor's chair in 76. Losing the first would not hurt his chances for the second. So in political 73, look for a lot of politicians trying to catch up with changes they did not expect. And remember that if political 72 taught us anything, it is that predictions made now don't mean much. Robert?
Well, Bob, talking about that, there's some people, you know, who say that John Coughlin's weather predictions are never worth much. But that's not true. Most of the time, they're not worth much. I take that back, John. I take it back.
Thank you, Bob. Well, you know, it'll come as no surprise to anyone here in Chicago that the year 1972 was colder and wetter than normal. In fact, in the past 100 years, only 10 years were colder. Despite all the rain we had this year, 20 out of the past 100 years were wetter. This year, we had our heaviest rains in August and September, when the north and northwest sides were hit hardest with resulting very heavy flooding. In fact, O'Hare Field received 6 more inches of rain than did Midway, which was out on the southwest side. Next year, well, Chicago's weather is more changeable than all but 2 other American cities, those 2 cities being Seattle and Boston. So, in the interest of accuracy, we're going to do as we did in 1972 and take the weather predictions day by day.
John, I suppose that most of us are as much concerned about the weather and about food and prices as we are about anything. John Esther has a consumer report.
John, it was a paradoxical year in 1972, Bob, as far as the consumer movement in Illinois is concerned. In the legislature, it was
Actually, a disaster year. No less than 16 consumer bills offering protection for credit buyers and food purchasers were all but ignored in Springfield. Though some of the bills did receive a hearing, none was reported out of committee, and none was passed. It's ironic, then, that the year marked a significant change in posture on the part of at least one of consumer advocates' favorite targets, the supermarkets. This year, marking the beginning of voluntary unit pricing in open dating in many food chains. This candid willingness on the supermarket's part to respond to consumer needs and demands came about, some say, as a result of negotiations with consumer advocate agencies, the militant National Consumers Union in particular. For whatever reason, the supermarket's change in attitude was hailed as overdue but welcome news to the consumer and serves as encouragement to adversaries to apply even more pressure for voluntary action in 1973. Probable targets next year, manufacturers and advertisers. Though most government consumer agencies, such as Chicago's Department of Consumer Sales, Weights and Measures, maintain their traditional low profile in 1972, Consumer Commissioner Mrs. Jane Burns scored a victory for the toddlers when she managed to get City Council approval for her Get Tough toy safety bill. The bottom line, there was no huge grassroots consumer revolution in Illinois again in 1972. But there was evidence that consumers nonetheless remained concerned. When TV2 News broadcast its hamburger quality findings recently, thousands responded in the mail seeking more information. Continued sharp consumer interest encourages the media to respond even more boldly, and we think you'll see some more of that kind of reporting in 1973, Bob.
And John, we'll be right back in a minute with Lee Phillip and Edwina Moore. We haven't said very much tonight about sudden disasters like the Illinois Central train crash or the Midway jetliner crash, but when we see people's lives cut short like that, it's a reminder that the city's real treasure is its people. Edwina Moore is new to Chicago. Lee Phillip is a native. Each has a special view of the city, a view that takes in important things about people. Edwina?
Bob, I've found Chicago to be a city of extremes, and I'm not limiting my observations to the weather, although that leaves a lot to be desired too. One of my first assignments after arriving in the city was to find housing for myself. I found the chore enjoyable but frustrating. Housing in Chicago is plentiful and relatively safe as long as one can afford to live close to the lake or in a residential community where neighbors usually require references from as far back as the 1600s. I found the people of Chicago to be extremely friendly, possibly the friendliest I've ever met. In no other city of comparable size can one walk down the street and get a smile and a warm hello from a total stranger. On the other hand, the people who smile pleasantly in the Loop or on North Michigan Avenue are the same ones who jealously guard their self-imposed boundaries in schools, even to the point of violence. If I sound as if I'm only knocking Chicago, that isn't so. I found the city fascinating, and if I were to rate it on a big city scale of 10, it would certainly rank among the top. Lee?
Well, Edwina, as you and Bob know, I was born and raised in this city, and I'm very proud of it and fond of it. And through our work, I've had a chance to meet all kinds of people from all backgrounds, races, and religions. And as Bob mentioned, that's what the city's all about. It's the people, and it's especially those people that are working hard to solve the problems that you mentioned. Well, you know Nancy Jefferson on the West Side and her group, and how hard they're working to make their community a place that they're proud of. And there's the Cabrini Green Group and the Cordy Marion Settlement House and all the settlement houses. And these are only a few of the thousands and millions of people that are working hard to solve the problems. And that's what it is. It's the people working with the elected officials that have to solve the problems to make this a better place for every single one of us to live in 73 and the years to come. Bob?
1972 was evidence that our biggest problem in Chicago is the great and growing gap between those who are doing well and those who are not. 1973 brings a new challenge and a new opportunity. I'm Bob McBride. Good night.
Chicago in Transition has been sponsored by Santa Fe, the complete transportation company.